Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. As someone who likes completion, I did convince Bror Saxberg to do at least 3 of these. This is now our third. This is the third piece of the trilogy. Bror, welcome back to Trending in Education.
It is a pleasure to be back. We had fun with the first couple of these discussions, and I think we'll have fun with this one as well, which is very different than the other two. So looking forward to our conversation.
And we'll see where things go. There may be more. And we're hoping to get a little more engagement as we continue to do this. So folks have questions or topics that you want us to talk about, we'll regroup and hopefully make this a little more of a conversation over time. Speaking of conversations, though, like putting this in context, we talked about parenting and the life cycle initially. Then we came back and talked a little more about the fact that we're living longer and we have combinatorial ways of thinking about the connections to the long lives that we live and the work lives and our, experiences across all that. That was our last time. And throughout all of that, one of the subtexts has been artificial intelligence. The goal here is to dig in a little more there, but again, from the lens of really learning first and learner-centric, which I know are both, things that are pretty central to everything I'm hearing from you, Bror. But where do you want to set us up? Where should we go from here?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to start from a sort of purely macro perspective, to put this a little bit in context, is to think about uses of technologies in other ecosystems and compare that to how the education and training ecosystem traditionally tries to use technologies to do good stuff. And so when you look at like the world of, let's say, medicine, which is an area I'm familiar with, the way medicine has made progress over the last 80 years is to start by looking very deeply at the biology, understanding how does this bug work? Is it a bug to begin with? What kind of bug? How does the body respond in detail? And over the decades, increasingly microscopic details, now down to the molecular biology of the surface proteins of immune cells and tissue cells and yada, 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 right? And what's interesting about that is from that increasingly detailed understanding of what's happening in the real world with human beings, emphasis on beings, you then generate hypotheses about what you might be able to do to help. Mm-hmm. If we could put a molecule in the way of this bug or this part of this bug or this part of this enzyme, that might actually help. Or if we goose this part of the human system, or this, it could be microscopic boost in the actual DNA, RNA, or whatever it is. That's a hypothesis for how to help. Then you test petri dishes, animals, humans, yada, yada, yada. But the initial insight is not, let's just spray chemicals on sick people and see what happens.
Right.
That's not how it's done.
Yeah.
Actually, the fun part is if you did that and ran a careful randomized controlled trial, group of sick people with chemicals sprayed on them, group of sick people without chemicals sprayed on them, you would discover no significant difference. Would you really conclude chemicals have no role in healthcare? Really? And of course, the missing link in that is you didn't fit the chemical to the problem. And I would argue a lot of the way technology gets pulled into education and training looks spraying technology on learning problems, where it's like, look, we're going to do a careful controlled trial of some learning.
Yeah.
So you spray laptops over a class of people or several classes in schools. Randomized controlled trial. So you're really going to do this well. You're going to do this.
You get to call it. You get to call it an RCT.
There you go. And then you come to the end and you look and you say, doesn't look like laptops actually affect learning. Mm-hmm. Oh no, another $5 billion wasted, right? It's like, wait, can we kind of think about the analogy here? Shouldn't we look at how human learning and motivation and belonging and identity actually seem to develop and work? And then look back at technologies to say, hey, do we have some technologies that could actually intervene or help or do some things?
Yeah.
And then design and test and try and prototype and up until you finally do your final tests and trials, at scale, randomized. And that is how so many other ecosystems have made progress.
Right. And if I'm reading you right, that's also perhaps how we'll try to attack this conversation today, in that there are three areas of work that humans do that you were thinking about talking about today. One is like learning production work, building out the content, that kind of thing. The other is the learning work itself. And then related to that is the work context in which humans are going to be operating, which I think many of us are realizing is going to be significantly transformed by the technology wave
Exactly.
powered by artificial intelligence. So that's the broader kind of structure that we wanted to get into here today, but it's really building on that same framework. One of the things that's come up a lot on the show is the importance of problem formulation as something that is human powered, or a place where human decision making is really critical. Like, where do we marshal our capabilities? Where do we point these new technologies? And that's really the way you're talking about this here, I think, within a learning context. What are the areas of problematicity that we could then think about how to bring the technology in?
Yes. And so we'll do it in that order that you mentioned, even though you might argue the better way to do it is to start from the skill redefinition piece.
Mm.
But I kind of thought of this as, let's go from the simplest, easiest, most obvious value creation to the soupier, what the heck is going on end
Yeah.
of this use of
Yeah.
AI lens.
Yeah. Let's devolve
And
at the end rather than right up
yeah,
top. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm happy to devolve anywhere, as you
Right.
know, Mike. But let's see if we can keep that towards the end. And so the first part is there is such clear and present value, as opposed to danger,
Yeah.
uh, in the use of AI to help accelerate all kinds of production work, and
Hmm.
so many industries are doing that, and the education ecosystem not different. So, for example, first drafts of text. Oh, let's let
Yeah.
the AI have a run at it, and first drafts of references with some guidance, some care, so that I get to read what's known about this topic
Right.
before I then engage with it as a producer of content of various kinds.
Mhm.
Days now, first drafts of drawings or
Yeah.
illustrations, and again, there is work going on to try to integrate some of the like multimedia principles into the AI agents.
Right.
So take into account things like cognitive load and trying to
Yeah.
avoid actions and so forth. So that's going to keep advancing. And I think that's exciting
Right.
if those guardrails principles are actually incorporated.
Mhm.
And even things like generating video, generating
Right.
animations or even more accurate kinds of,
ScarJo would say generating voice is quote unquote generating voice is another way to question
absolutely.
that, but that's an interesting space for sure.
Yes. And also then, because you are bringing down the cost per minute dramatically, the opportunity to make many different voices, many different images, videos,
Right.
to match the context of a learner
Hmm.
now suddenly becomes economically feasible, right?
Personalization. Yes.
Exactly, exactly. And so even at the production end, it's an example of how, well, wait, if you start from how learning works, we already have a ton of evidence that it's powerful for a new difficult skill
Mm.
to begin from what is familiar and motivating to a learner, and then practice your new skill in that context so that you reduce the cognitive load. You're not
Mhm.
trying to learn a new topic, a new domain,
Mhm.
along with learning a new skill. You're working on a domain you already know and love and have mastered, but now you're practicing a new skill. I think we may have mentioned this, one of the other sessions. It's like, learning to write persuasively, right? If you're having to learn how to read Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and understand what the heck is going on, and at the same time, that's what you're supposed to learn to write persuasively about,
Hmm.
just tripled things up for most students. Now,
Right.
there's a few students who grew up speaking Elizabethan English, and for them, this is easy. And so, this is where trying to figure out human learning, human motivation, guess what? The AI can now help you start to produce multiple variations
Mhm.
that ordinarily humans could do a couple, maybe
Right.
three, but you run out of gas, or you can get to 20 different hobbies, interests,
Right.
contacts,
Sure.
uh, accents, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So to me, the production work piece is really exciting. And again, the trick here is it has to be coupled with human oversight.
Mhm.
We know this, whether it's hallucinations or confabulations or just wonky, weird things. AIs are not perfect. I mean, it's a
Right.
little like, having a junior assistant who's eager
Yeah.
and energetic and sure they can do the job, boss. You actually got to look at it. I mean, you can't just say, "I'm sure this is right," and just publish it, right?
Right.
Uh, and so that combination, and we'll come back to this in the skill redefinition part. That's where humans still remain incredibly valuable, even in this production side.
Yeah.
That's kind of the first area that I think is powerful.
Yeah, and for me, as someone who worked at Kaplan early in my career as a curriculum writer and as an instructional designer, that space has always been interesting to me, and it's continued to evolve as the tools have evolved. And this is the next iteration of that tool set. What's exciting is the democratization of some of this, where you could envision more makers emerging who can start to, we were joking a bit earlier about creating your own custom chatbots.
Yeah.
That technology is already here. I imagine it'll continue to get better, even though I'm calling it Clippy's revenge. There is this sense of you can have a partner, you can have an agent, and then to your point, you can be somewhat directive with it. And then that does speak to, I guess, two dimensions of that, where how does that then impact how we learn? And then what kind of skills are we going to need to continue to be relevant in our jobs? But thoughts about the learning work side of this?
Yeah, and even just to finish that last thought that you had there, one of the interesting things you mentioned about, guiding, training these AIs, by working directly with them. There is a really interesting, you could call it both a threat and an opportunity, which is, as I said earlier, trying to make sure that you give these AIs more guidance about what will work better for learning, right? So, yeah, you can generate tons of text. I mean,
Right.
it's not hard, and it's getting easier, to generate encyclopedias worth of
Yeah.
text, right?
Right.
No, but that's not necessarily better for learning,
Mhm.
right? So there's going to be a really interesting. I mean, I hope this is the thing that people, like I said, in our ecosystem tend to ignore a lot of learning science, and they'll just go straight for, "Wow, you mean I can generate 1,000 words instead of 100?
Right.
So cheap. Let's generate 10,000 words. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's better, right? Than a
Right.
thousand, 100 times better than 100 words, right?
Yeah.
Like, guys, no, not for learning, not even for novel writing. No,
Right.
helpful. You don't want a 10-volume version of what should have been a short romance novel. That's not actually good writing at all.
Right.
It's that notion of, can we get principles into the AIs
Hmm.
so that they begin to pay attention to that? That's one. And that's kind of the threat. You got to do that. The opportunity is, unlike maybe human beings, once you have it in there, many people can get benefit from that.
Right.
It's a bit like you train up a junior instructional designer
Mhm.
on the learning science, learning engineering, because they often don't get that in their earlier work or career training. But once you have them trained, wow, now they start to do it on their own and
Right.
begin really internalize it. It's only one instructional designer. And so the pipeline that goes through that one instructional designer is narrow. It's great, but it's also narrow. Whereas maybe with these production agents that become increasingly learning production agents, not just randomized volume production agents,
Yep.
many people could then draw on them in parallel. So
Mhm.
that's kind of exciting.
Yeah.
You still cannot lose the human side. Now, the learning piece of this, even if you have your agents tuned up to make great learning materials, right? They're still delivering. And it is, doing that well still requires that, and all the evidence says it's got to be some kind of adaptive back and forth, right?
Yep.
That's why the one human tutors, well trained, still remain the champions of human learning. They
Right.
still are the best, the fastest, I wouldn't say the most efficient from a cash standpoint,
Sure.
but time standpoint can be the most efficient for the learning side, right?
Yeah.
And obviously they are too expensive. There was actually a DARPA initiative a dozen years ago or so that created a tutor for IT professionals in the Navy. They were trying to figure out, how do we accelerate the ability of IT professionals to diagnose and treat IT problems on board a ship, right?
Yep.
You're far away from anywhere. How do you do that when you're just, you're locked away on the ocean someplace?
Hmm.
And so the way they got at this group that went after this, funded by DARPA, was to first find very high quality IT tutors, people who knew how to kind of one-to-one train people.
Yep.
They got them to work on and design some training and then watch them do their training work and saw, wow, these guys, by working with trainees in this one-to-one way over 6 weeks, they were able to get those trainees to solve IT problems at the level of people who'd spent a decade or more at sea.
Yeah.
So they had 10 weeks of expertise development crushed down into 6 weeks of one-to-one tutorial back and forth, day after day over a 6-week period, which is intense.
Yeah.
Shows what a mind can do if you give it the right adaptive support. And then their next step, this was long before AI, was to convert what the tutors were doing into kind of rule-driven. In those days, it might have been called artificial intelligence, but it was really,
Yeah.
conditional
Conditional logic. Yeah. Mhm.
And they were able to show that that automated system got nearly as good results
Mhm.
as, and they spent tens of millions of dollars doing that. I mean,
Yeah.
hiring the tutors and then following them and
Right.
deconstructing
You're saying this is this DARPA money. So yeah.
DARPA money, right? So $30 million to build a 6-week training course
Yeah.
for IT professionals.
Right. And by the way, for our listeners, if there's any DARPA listeners out there who want to send Trending in Education some of that sweet, sweet DARPA cash, my DMs are open. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so, too expensive. Can't replicate, for normal use.
Yeah.
DARPA pulled it off, but no. Well, so what's interesting is now you have AI, and it does have these natural conversational opportunities.
Yep.
So there is a natural and exciting thing to work on, which is, well, how can we get an AI to begin to converse with a student around a learning topic?
Yep.
And do some of that adaptive goodness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, as we talked about earlier, the difficulty is in just letting him rip.
Right.
How can I help you today? And then, a general purpose large language model is set loose on teaching chemistry.
Yeah.
It's like, well, first, at best, you will get the median internet understanding of chemistry.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think, but I think that's not necessarily great.
You're right. Right.
Some might be great, but some might be kind of kooky.
Yeah.
And no filtering, because that's not what AIs do on their own, right?
Right.
So, but more than that is what we said earlier, which is, well, wait, now, how does learning work? And so, again, if you go back to those basic principles that we talked about in several of these sessions, you think about, okay, motivation, right? What is it that gets in the way of people starting, persisting, and putting in mental effort?
Mhm.
Okay, they value what they're doing and why they're doing it. Do they think they can do it at all?
Mhm.
Do they think something's in their way? And then the hardest and most complicated, are they in a bad place? Negative
Yeah.
emotional states, right?
Mm,
The last one may be harder for AI to do much with, by itself. That feels like you got to have humans in the loop,
Yeah.
deeply in the loop on that one.
Right.
First three, this is a thing to think about.
Mm.
So, for example, valuing. So before you just start spewing information about chemistry, in 2-syllable words, because it's simpler, instead, you should be engaging with the student to say, well, what are you interested in?
Right.
And you're going to find a way to, and that's what good human tutors do. They find a way to get chemistry into everything.
Right.
Interested in printed or electronic, right? And so printed, we can talk about dyes and printing and, all kinds of stuff about colors and where do they come from. We're going to have fun with that, right? And so that notion of, well, we should begin, as a good human tutor does, with some conversation to understand your interests, right?
Yep. Mhm.
Okay, so that's too expensive to have humans do. Is there a technology that might be able to do an adaptive interview to understand topics?
Yeah.
I think so.
Mhm.
That's where we would say, let's train an AI
Yeah.
to become good at unpacking a student's interests
Mhm.
and be able to sort of start creating a profile of the student
Yeah.
that's more than, ignorant of the table of elements.
Right.
It's no, what are your topics of interest, right?
Mhm. It
And
opens up some interesting questions too, I think just around the nature of assessment, depending on what you're
yeah,
trying to
yeah,
assess, where we're all in these real-time dialogues with these things, which also works around some of the cheating risk. You have to
definitely.
actually engage in real time, and if the assessment is a chatbot as opposed to some of the more traditional assessment formats, it's kind of interesting because I think you do start to develop a model of the learner if you're from the other side and you're saying, okay, I'm going to be tracking the human outputs. There's probably a little bit of risk around trust and making sure that folks are actually willing to put themselves forward, and obviously, data privacy, cybersecurity, all the kind of plumbing that keeps
Yeah.
our
Oh, yeah.
digital universe operating.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting set of tools that we're kind of throwing into the mix here.
I agree. And actually, you're completely right. People are very worried about cheating and all that kind of stuff. And that's, so 20th century, right? To worry about technology that's obviously going to become crucial to your work life,
Yeah.
that using it when you're a student is cheating.
Right.
It's like, how about preparation for the rest of your life instead of
Yeah.
cheating, right? Like use of
Right.
calculators in the 1990s. It's like,
Yeah.
that's not cheating. That's figuring out how you're going to keep
Right.
working. And so
Right.
same thing will be true here, I think. And that's where, and we're going to get to this in a minute or a few minutes, the skill redefinition part.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you assess the human skills? And again, to your point, a one-to-one human tutor has a really rich model
Hmm.
of what learners can be like and where can they be most likely to fail along the way.
Yep.
So even, and this is the interesting thing, they don't even have to ask you questions. They can just watch you work.
Yeah.
And if they watch you work, so,
Mhm.
case of like a computer AI watching you put in drafts of your answers,
Yep.
or with new camera-based AIs,
Sure.
they can
Yeah.
interpret your sketches. So you're kind of drawing out chemical molecules or
Right.
processes or equations.
Not to mention, micro expressions
Oh,
and
yeah.
any of
All
that
of
kind of
those
stuff.
things.
Yeah.
Do you appear confused and so forth? And there's even been careful empirical work on that going back a decade and more of looking at like clickstream patterns. They correlate with your emotional state and they can get 60, 70% accuracy by just using the clickstream patterns.
Right.
So as you say, now imagine using some facial recognition and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So in this way, you can then begin to create a much richer hypothesis generation and testing system around, are we there yet?
Right.
The kid's question in the back of the car, has this
Yeah.
person mastered this?
Right.
And by watching how they work, and the funny thing is the best tutors, even if the answer isn't quite right, the tutor can tell by how you got there that, yeah, you made an arithmetic error at the end,
Yeah.
but actually everything else is fine. No, we
Right.
don't have to start this over, right?
Right.
So that's at the other end, the assessment end. And then in the middle, that back and forth so that you can kind of try some practice. AIs are able to do like cases and simulations. So
Hmm.
bring it, again, for motivation reasons, bring it closely into areas you care about instead of, let's invert this 3x3 matrix. Yes, kids, we love that.
Yeah.
It's like, no, this is a description of forces and tensions around
Right.
the shell in a baseball field. And if we get it wrong, everybody will go up to their ankles in the mud. So let's talk about how do we figure this out? Blah, blah, blah,
Right.
blah. And I made that up. I don't even know if that works, but
Right.
just,
We'll
you know,
double check it against an
yeah,
LLM
please.
just to make sure it
Those,
was
those, those DARPA people, you got the technology and the abilities, or we'll let our chat bots check that out to see if I got a tensor thing right with anyway.
right. Yeah.
So, but that notion then of being able to engage in a dialogue and listen to the reasoning, right? So it's
Mhm.
not like, tell me the answer, right? It's like, what would you do next? Says the
Right.
AI.
Right.
Just like a human tutor would say, so what's your next step?
Yeah.
It's like with writing persuasively,
Hmm.
structured writing processes are actually powerful ways to get started learning how to do that. Tons of evidence about it, right? So
Right. Right.
in addition to maybe starting by saying things along those lines and giving some exercises on that, next writing topic about a thing you love and know, how would you get started? And if the kid says, I don't know, stream of consciousness, it's kind of like, well, let's talk about structured writing. Weren't we just talking about structured writing? The good news is, unlike me, you can code the AI not to be snarky, right?
Right.
Hey,
Right.
it's tough. Or
Yeah.
he maybe not to be snarky.
Maybe a little narcometer dial where I could tune it up or down.
And that's what, it's funny. Patients working now with AI diagnosticians, one, the empirical results are similar to human expert physicians. Two, the patients like the AIs way more than the medical people, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Because medical people, they're in a rush. They're used to
Yeah.
15 minutes and I gotta get out of here.
Right.
So this conversation about your garden, I gotta cut it off. I really don't care. I gotta get
Right.
back to my
Yeah.
script,
Right.
Is gardens, I love gardens, flowers. Where are we going with this? And so you can, there's a cool one-to-one thing that can
Mhm.
happen here that's connected to your interests, a warm spirit, right? Reinforce learning, reinforce failure is not a problem. And in fact, again, learners report they're much more comfortable screwing up
Yeah.
with an AI
Yeah.
they are with the human for a couple of reasons. One is fear of failure themselves, but two is worry that they'll get lashed out at.
Yeah. No
Right.
judgment.
Yeah, and they know it's a machine. So it's
Sure.
like, one, I don't have to care.
Right.
And two, especially after the first interaction, you discover they're just infinitely supportive.
Right.
They honestly have nowhere else to go. I mean, it's
Right.
not like going
Yeah.
about it there. I mean,
Right. And then the attribution problem is a challenge, but afterwards you get to say, look what I made. You can share around to the
yes,
world like what you were able to
exactly.
kind of co-create
And,
with
and
an
also
agent, you
in the
know?
attribution thing, and again, that may be harder for an AI, but that notion of things that you think are in your way, but actually aren't, again, that can be a dialogue with the AI around, what are the things that you think are going to be in your way of doing your best work?
Right.
Depending on what's said, you can talk about, well, how will you get at that? What, have you
Right.
thought up? And is there anything that you could do to,
It
make
almost
those
it
things
almost
better?
goes back to the original use of Eliza, where now instead of sort of the therapeutic friend, it's more the cognitive
Learning friend.
learning friend. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
The question that I always come back to on that is like how much we lose by not being in the unaided mode, and when should folks, it reminds me of, Yoda, maybe it was Obi-Wan, but like when Luke was blindfolded, when he couldn't actually see. And if you allow that these AIs are giving us new sight, you know, how do we train ourselves to work without them? It almost does seem like there will be a bit of a loss. It's like folks who are lamenting the fact that we're no longer able to write in cursive as a species. Like, is there some cognitive gap that we're suffering from that we're not really
Right.
aware of?
Well, you're actually previewing potentially that next topic around work skills, because wasn't it Socrates who was really upset with Plato about the use of books?
Hmm.
Because Socrates said correctly, you're going to ruin human memory
Right,
by having people rely on these books to look things up.
right.
The previous,
No method of loci required.
right? Yeah, exactly. And no practice on long form memorization
Right.
to build up those muscles of how you keep things in your head forever with
Yeah.
no cues and so forth. And
Practice? You talk to me about practice.
yeah, that's the kind of thing. And the interesting thing is, Socrates was actually right, right? Almost none of us invest time and effort or have the skills to
Yeah.
memorize the entire Iliad
Right.
front to back.
Mental
What?
athletes. I think they're actually called people go to memory
And
games. Yeah.
it's fun, but it's kind of medieval sports. Okay, it's all right. Being the
Like
best in the
like
world.
cognitive LARPing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No insult to all the
Come at
enthusiasts.
me. Come at me. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just from
I'm
my
gonna edit it. I'll edit it
standpoint,
all out. Yeah.
respect
We're safe.
for
We're
LARPing.
safe. Yeah.
But that and he was not wrong, Socrates, about the change that happened. Now, the challenge is, yeah, but that wasn't destructive to humanity. I mean, that was what Socrates was fearful of.
I
Is you're
see.
going to destroy our ability to make progress and do
Right.
things,
Hmm.
because in Socrates' view of how essential long form memory was,
Hmm.
turned out not as much, right?
Right.
That use of books, even though we didn't get the practice of long form memory, the ability to distribute widely all of this information,
Yeah.
the ability to have access to information at a moment's notice,
In a consistent way too. Yeah.
consistent way, coherent way, no change,
Yeah.
person to generation by generation, right? Tons of benefits, right?
Mhm.
And so I think there's got to be a similar fight. Don't call it a fight. Call it a rich conversation around what are those things that are okay to be left behind. So, for example,
Hmm.
I can't remember the last time I sharpened a quill.
Yeah.
I don't know. You might be up on
I
this.
usually just pluck them real sharp, but that's how I
Okay.
roll. Yeah.
It's like, now that used to be actually a pretty important part of being
Yeah.
a good writer is you
Right.
have to get the quill right and then the
Mm.
loading of ink so you didn't
Yeah.
blot copybook,
Fair.
which now it's merely a metaphor,
Yeah.
maybe archaic metaphor, but used to be, your penmanship, literally your skills with a pen, right? Now, writing has
Mhm.
nothing whatsoever to do with the skills of keeping ink in a bird feather, right?
Right.
You could argue, shame, shame, we lost that.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't think that's holding us back.
What I've
So,
heard, and I think it was Dwayne Matthews who I had on a little while back, he referred to it as the cognitive surplus that will be created with this stuff. And then the threat opportunity, I'm going to call it a threat opportunity. I don't know. I'm still workshopping it,
opportunity,
but the opera threat didn't sound right. But the opportunity
opportunity.
and the threat is, we have this extra capacity that's freed up. What are we able to apply it to? And then there was at least a history of like learning to do hard things did develop a level
Yeah,
of resilience and commitment and resolve, determination, a lot of, character traits, quote unquote, that, I think we do aspire to nowadays. And I think there's a risk that if these training wheels are everywhere,
yeah.
we're kind of
Whatever.
losing some
Yes.
sort of fundamental balance or some fundamental capacities. Maybe it's just the natural evolution of things, but I think there is some reasonable concern there.
Yeah, let's go there. This is now we've managed to evolve our way to that topic around skills and reskilling and so forth.
Yeah.
So there's several things that are interrelated here that are kind of important to just put on the table at the same time. One is the way AI is going to change the nature of work. That it is and should do a lot of really helpful stuff for people
Mhm.
to accelerate productivity, progress,
Yeah,
processes.
and also this is even accepting where I'm landing on this is at a minimum, AI is around an internet level innovation, where
Yeah,
much in the way that the personal computer and then the
yeah,
internet and some of these other major technological advances, this is at least of that level. Debatable whether it's more, but let's at least accept that it's that foundational so that the way we worked 20 years ago is very different than the way we work today. And even 5, 10 years from now, due to this major
absolutely.
transformation, work will be significantly different in the next phase.
Absolutely. And you can see this already in other fields, even before AI. I was funny just this morning, I was talking to an architect here, a senior guy, and he was saying how, decades ago when he started, he was making physical models and doing his sketches by hand to help, clients understand spatial things and all this. And so the result of that was in part a real training in spatial awareness that came from using your hands to actually make things and do those things over and over and over and over again, right?
Yeah.
And now you have CAD that generates these models immediately. And
Yeah.
his view was he felt like something was still lost in the younger group of architects who didn't have to build by hand
Yeah.
and build that sort of spatial awareness, right? So we
Hmm.
get back to that in a few minutes. But the
Yeah.
first is to recognize, look, jobs are going to be different. There's no question about it. One interesting example of this was the New York Times just a month or two ago published an article about investment bankers. And investment bankers are kind of a tough crowd. And they were really excited about how they could fire all their junior bankers
Yeah.
because junior bankers typically spend 100 hours a week at vast expense,
Yeah.
simply moving blocks of text, legal text with slight modifications from one regulatory filing form to another, local, state, federal, on, right? It's horrible, right? It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that's what they do, 100 hours a week. And if you think about, what AI can do, this is a perfect task for AI. You still
Right.
need some supervisory stuff, but you don't need those hordes of, $150,000 a year people
Yeah.
just out of the school. Sure, factual. Life is good. Now, the thing that nobody talked about and the New York Times didn't write about is, okay, if we lose that whole layer,
Yeah.
entry level people, I mean, you think about the career in many fields, right? Whether it's journalism or investment banking or all kinds of fields, you have these pyramids, right?
Yeah.
Where people start doing journeyman work, right? Entry
Right.
level work,
Yeah.
right?
The lower
And
rungs on the ladder. Yeah. Mhm.
and And what happens in investment banking, like anywhere else, is 95, 6% of your work is this tedious, mind numbing, copying, pasting, slight editing. And 2 or 3% are conversations with senior bankers about the deal and what's
Yep.
happening and how did you think of this and
Mhm.
why did you put this in and not this other thing, right?
Right.
And the huge dominant task is ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Which is why a lot of people just hate their lives and
Right.
leave.
But although they're also building social capital and they are connecting with other people, not just senior, they're also building
With each
lateral
other.
connections and, sort of owning the lower rungs so that they
And there are
can
a lot of
eventually
people,
climb.
and
Yeah.
it's actually a really good point. A lot of people who lead from the lower rungs, they still maintain that social capital and can draw on that over time.
Hmm.
What you have in the investment banking profession is you get this laddering where lots leave early and there's a fewer left who are able to spend more time on not the legal moving around. They supervise that, but now they're talking more about deal making and who do we contact and what are the terms we use and
Hmm.
depending on the investment bank, how do we make sure we make the most money and everybody else gets nuked? Sure. Name no
Right.
name.
Right.
No. And
Also known as marketing. Yes.
oh yeah, and you keep going up, right? What's interesting is okay, if you fire all your junior bankers, you will actually survive for like 5 or 10 years because you still have the editorial layer. They
Yep.
haven't retired, they haven't gone elsewhere, but you have missed something. Who is going to then come up the ranks? And this
Yeah.
is where we get to kind of the second critical thing here about use of AI. One, as we said, it will change work. No question. Okay. Two, given that there are new things we need humans to do, or they might be old things, but they still have to do them, like editorial, right?
Yeah.
You still need editors at a high level in newspapers and magazines, all that, to take the initial copy, whether it's from a junior human
Yep.
or whether it's from an AI,
Yep.
and you have to check it and say, more like this, less like this. Did you think about this other thing? Have you read this other piece? We should, right? That's what these senior people do. They don't write it from scratch.
Yeah.
They get feedback
Right.
and they send them back, right?
Hmm.
And now the loop is measured in minutes, right? Whereas before the loop used to be measured in hours or days to get
Yeah.
the rewrite, right? But you see, you need to learn to be an editor or a banker, right? And
Right.
the interesting thing is, in the past, the way you became a good editor was you wrote thousands upon thousands of articles
Yep.
and got yelled at by other editors.
Yep.
And you rewrote them, right? And then you got yelled
It's
at by editors.
it's deliberate practice. Yeah.
Yes. And not necessarily with any formal clarity of what are the editing skills I'm trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Right? What I would argue now is, look, we're going to get rid of maybe the incredibly inefficient way human brains became good at banking, editing,
Yep.
instructional design. And so,
Mm.
because we have to clear out all that inefficient grunt work, but we still need the experienced humans.
Right.
And so to me, what this says is, and again, I haven't seen this from anyone else, including like bankers, is wait, we got to clarify, what is it that senior bankers do? What do they decide to do? And what is the way that we're going to take 22-year-olds and turn them into 32-year-old bankers,
Right.
right? Because we just lost the
Right.
incredible inefficient existing way where we
Mhm.
1,000 of them and we'd end up with 10 after 10 years, right?
Right.
And that was probably ridiculous and stupid to begin with, but it was how you got the necessary grunt work done.
Right.
Now you have no grunt work.
Hmm.
Can't have no skill building.
Right. I've heard this also characterized as the experience gap, where, the entry level jobs get higher and higher because we automate a lot of what had historically been intern or entry level work. And then before you know it, the lowest rungs are pretty high up there. So that someone coming right out of college or right out of high school or whatever boot camp.
Yeah, you run the risk you're going to end up, whether it's in medicine or banking or journalism, with the new person saying, well, how the hell would I know?
Right.
Expert system says.
Hmm.
So I assume that's right. I mean,
Right.
why is something wrong? Because
Exactly. And that kind of gets back to your emphasis on motivation is something I've tried to pick up on as it relates to learning. But I think it is really thinking about that early career mindset right now, like that first good job. Ryan Craig's been on the show a few times, likes to talk about apprenticeships as that model, but like, are there alternative
Exactly.
ways of thinking about exposing people to this type of work. Matt Wilkerson, I had on recently from Extern, and he was talking about creating a marketplace for work experience. Ripen is another company I've heard of, which provides real life work problems to higher ed faculty. But it does feel like there is a new awakening that is happening, but it's perhaps not as widely adopted. And then a lot of it, I think, comes back to some design thinking and some thoughtfulness in terms of how you're building these learning ecosystems. It's been amazing. We're definitely going to have you back more, Roar. But as we continue here, maybe starting to bring it towards some kind of crescendo of sorts.
Yes.
Where
So
are we going?
yeah. So here's kind of what I think of as a final and crazy complexity in this. Okay. So human minds are not like computers. And an example of this is we don't have a delete key for burned in expertise. Meaning, if you spent 10 years burning in decisions, patterns, ways of thinking, and now they're not the right things for a human to do anymore.
Right.
I mean, in the teaching world, you spend 10 years being the sage on the stage. We know you actually better is to be a guide on the side. And we now have lots of tools to
Mhm.
support you in letting students work now with technology and future AI.
Yeah.
And you a new set of tools, right? So you can train yourself to become that guide on the side. But here's the problem with the biology of learning. Evolution had no reason to install a delete key.
Yeah.
The
Rewind button.
beauty,
Yeah.
yeah, the beauty of the human nervous system is it starts kind of empty-ish, and then in context, it builds a whole set of new skills, right?
Yeah.
Fitted to context, fitted to your technologies, fitted to your culture and your, agriculture and all the rest of it. And you could live the rest of your life beneficially off of that expertise. We are now in a situation where our ecosystem has evolved where we need to change skills, not every generation, but often, every 2 years, every 3 years. Well, so sometimes, all the time I spent learning to do long division by hand, waste.
Right.
I'm never doing it. I haven't done it in 10 years.
Yeah.
I'm not doing it. Nobody cares. It's in there,
Yeah.
right? Enough space, right?
Right.
Away.
Right.
It's not in the way of anything else. And frankly, our long-term memory is huge. It's not like my
Yeah.
brain is full. I pity about that long-term memory. That's not the problem. The problem is when what you burned in is like being sage on the stage. Because what the evidence shows is as soon as you are under pressure,
Right.
you revert to the first thing you mastered.
Mm-hmm.
It should be a last in, first out system.
Mm.
It is not.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back, and that is incredibly badly designed. Incredibly badly designed. So what this says to me, and this is where it gets soupy and hard, is, so there is a reason to be quite careful about what you practice enough to burn in.
Mm.
Because there's one thing about being familiar with long division
Right.
or being familiar with lecturing and rhetoric and all that. Okay, well, that's one thing.
Yeah.
It's another thing to literally burn it in.
Right.
To make it be part of your long-term memory, non-conscious, tacit skills and all this stuff, right? And so we should be doing is thinking hard about, okay, well, what are the skills that will be valuable lifelong?
Right.
And this is where I think it gets really interesting is to think about, for example, those editing skills around oversight, supervision, looking after work of others, that's long-term valuable. Right. So that kind of training, it's not going to go away, that you're going to keep doing that.
Right.
The whole class of these skills, Mike, is brain to brain skills.
Mm.
So skills of empathizing,
Yeah.
collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
communicating, perspective taking,
Right.
all of those kinds of things. Because again, the nervous systems are not changing at the rate that AI is changing.
Right.
Nervous systems under the influence of hormones and all the rest of it, that's going to work the same
Right.
100 years from now as it does now, as it did 250,000 years ago, right?
Right. Right.
Skill building around being better at brain to brain things
Yeah.
is highly valuable, which means if you take it all the way to the bleeding edge, we should be doing those kinds of things in preschool.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of number slinging and a whole bunch
Right.
of formula stuff and all that, I'm not saying it's bad to become familiar with that.
Right.
spending all your time on worksheets of 3-digit additions
Yeah.
and essentially accidentally no time or little time on how do we talk to each other? How do I
Right.
understand how you look at the world? How do I
Yeah.
deeply ingrain the fact that the same thing is going to affect you differently than it affects me,
Right.
right? Right now, we tend to believe you're like me.
Right.
If I get angry about a thing on the screen, you must be angry too, right? And
Hmm.
we know now how devastatingly wrong that can be.
Hmm.
How your nervous system has been brought up in your context, how
Yeah.
mine was brought up in context, we can end up reacting very differently. Plus, we have very different contributions to make,
Right.
collaborative setting and situation. And so becoming good at pulling out what are the differences in this room,
Right.
as opposed to, well, you're all thinking what I'm thinking, becomes the new set of skills that will work for a very long time. And sort
Mm.
of thinking through even beyond those kinds of things, what are those things that are going to work for many decades more
Right.
and make, as you said before, make room in our teaching and training calendar
Mhm.
by getting rid of stuff that you need to be familiar with, but not spend 1,000 hours burning in.
Right.
So I think if we did this right, our education work, powered by simulations, AI conversations generated, multiple different perspective conversations generated by AIs. And my job is how would I weave these together? And then I get feedback from the AI and ultimately feedback from a human coach. Blah, blah, blah. It could end up looking really different to get me ready for that new world of transformed work
Right.
for my entire career.
Mm. Lots to chew on, as always, with Dr. Bror Saxberg. It's been amazing having these conversations, Bror. We're going to have to keep it going. Final words. That was a nice crescendo there. Any parting thoughts if folks want to have any takeaways from our conversation?
I think that the biggest thing is kind of the continuing theme through all of our conversations, which is there is tremendous reason to be optimistic about what's coming for human beings, human skills, human developments, because of the opportunities of new ways of learning, technology plus the learning science. If we're going to get there, we really have to have a dread focus and improved precision around how does human learning work?
Yeah.
How does human motivation work? How does collaboration work? What are those skills?
Yeah.
And then turn those into new learning environments that actually focus on those skills as opposed to accidentally other things. So there's a lot to be happy about going forward, but we really have to pay attention in order to get there.
Amazing stuff, as always, with Bror Saxberg, the founder of Learning Forge and regular guest here on Trending in Education. Bror, thanks again for joining me on today's show.
Thank you for having me again, Mike.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe or write a review, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.